It started with a chair. A simple courtroom chair, cold, metal, unremarkable. But by the time that chair hit the floor, something far more powerful had been set into motion. A system was about to tremble. A man would lose the authority he abused. And a woman, quiet, composed, unseen, was about to reveal the kind of leadership this city had forgotten existed. Monday morning. The courthouse was packed, the air dense with the usual weight of anxiety and routine legal chaos. Lawyers clutched briefcases, families whispered nervously, and officers stood with arms crossed, scanning the crowd like sentries. In the very back row sat a black woman in a tailored navy blue suit, posture flawless, eyes calm but focused. She held a file, flipping through pages with the kind of stillness that draws more attention than noise. No one quite knew who she was. She wasn't a defendant, she wasn't listed as counsel, but something about her demanded respect if you were smart enough to see it. Officer Bradley Walker wasn't one of those people. The moment he noticed her, his body stiffened. Bradley was the kind of cop whose badge gave him permission to belittle, not protect. His name echoed in hallways for all the wrong reasons. Excessive force, public complaints, whispered warnings passed between junior officers. But what he saw in Denise Carter wasn't a person with purpose. To him, she was a problem, a black woman in his space, sitting where she didn't belong. That was all the justification he needed. He marched over, towering above her like a predator about to pounce. "You can't sit there," he snapped. No greeting, no explanation, just force. Denise looked up, steady, professional, unshaken, and replied with a calm that only comes from years of experience. "I'm here on official business." Bradley's lips curled in irritation. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask which. Business. That's not how men like him operate. He believed in power over dialogue. So he acted, not like an officer of the law, but like a schoolyard bully with a badge. He kicked the leg of her chair. The sudden jolt knocked her papers onto the floor. A few gasps rippled through nearby seats. Then came the muttered insult. Low, venomous, racial. He said it softly but loud enough that she'd hear, loud enough to assert dominance. And then he smirked, because in his mind, he'd won. But what Bradley Walker failed to realize in that moment, what would haunt him hours later, was that the woman he just disrespected wasn't some random civilian. She wasn't lost. She wasn't powerless. In fact, she held more power than he could ever imagine. And the very file that now lay scattered across the courthouse floor, it held the blueprints for his downfall. Denise Carter didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or call security. She simply gathered her papers one by one, as if she were collecting pieces of a plan already in motion. Because Denise wasn't here for a courtroom drama. She was here to watch, to observe, to confirm what she'd already heard about Officer Bradley Walker. And when the time was right, when the whole world was watching, she would deliver justice, in a way he'd never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who stays silent the longest. There's a difference between silence and stillness. One is passive, the other is powerful. That morning, Denise Carter wasn't just silent. She was still, purposefully so. In a room full of nervous chatter, the clicking of legal heels on tiled floors, the rustle of manila folders, and the monotone announcements of court clerks, Denise sat completely composed. Not a twitch, not a glance around the room to look busy. She didn't need to. She wasn't there to plead, defend, or argue. She was there to witness. The downtown courthouse was already simmering with tension when the doors opened. People spilled in like a rising tide, some fresh off the bus, others escorted in handcuffs. Family members clung to hope. Lawyers barked into phones. Uniformed officers stood rigid at their posts, some going through the motions, others wearing the smug satisfaction of power they thought no one would ever question. In the back row, a woman in a crisp navy blue suit reviewed a manila file. Her posture spoke louder than any name tag. Her demeanor carried the weight of someone who had been here before, but not as a defendant, not as a lawyer. She wasn't reacting to the courtroom. She was reading it, studying it like a battlefield. Every corner, every voice, every gesture. That woman was Denise Carter, and across the room, Officer Bradley Walker was already watching her, but not with curiosity, with suspicion. To him, she didn't belong, not because of what she was doing, but because of who she was. A black woman, confident, silent, unapologetically present. That was all the reason he needed to take offense. Officer Walker had a reputation, a long one. Among the junior officers, he was known for belittling community members and flying off the handle without provocation. Behind closed doors, his name had been whispered in more than a few internal complaints. But like many officers who know the system shields them, he wore those rumors like a badge of defiance. So when he noticed Denise, he didn't approach with curiosity or respect. He walked toward her with intent. She didn't even flinch. She simply looked up, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. When he demanded she leave the seat, she responded simply, "I'm here on official business. No confrontation, no apology, just calm clarity." And that's what made him furious. She didn't cower. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't even ask for his name. She gave him no ammunition to escalate, so he created his own. In a moment that would sear itself into the memory of every bystander, Officer Walker lifted his boot and kicked the leg of her chair. A loud crack. The chair jolted. Her papers, neatly arranged files she'd been reviewing, spilled across the courthouse floor like a broken truth trying to be heard. The gasp that rippled through the courtroom was barely audible but deeply felt. A few eyes darted toward the source of the conflict. Others pretended not to notice because people learn over time that looking too long at injustice sometimes makes you a target too. But Denise didn't rise. She didn't snap back. She looked down at her papers, took a breath, then slowly bent to pick them up one by one. To anyone watching, it may have looked like submission, but it wasn't. It was restraint. Purposeful, deliberate restraint, because Denise Carter was not here to fight a battle in a courtroom hallway. She was here to witness the system she had been tasked with reforming. She had heard the whispers about Officer Walker. She had reviewed the misconduct reports. She had seen the data, the complaints, the uninvestigated incidents, the abuse swept under internal memos. But data only tells half the story. She needed to see it, feel it. And now she had. Bradley Walker, in all his arrogance, had revealed himself without prompting. He had shown her exactly what kind of officer he was, not in a file or testimony, but with his own actions. The kick, the slur muttered under his breath, the dismissive sneer on his face, all without knowing he was being watched by someone who could end his career in a single stroke of a pen. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to argue. She just kept picking up her papers. The last one had a folded corner. She smoothed it gently before slipping it back into her folder. Then she sat again, silent, still, like nothing had happened. But inside, she wasn't quiet. She was recording every detail, mentally filing this moment. Not just for disciplinary reports, but for transformation. Because Denise Carter knew that systems don't just change with slogans or speeches. They change when you expose their rot, slowly, precisely, publicly. Bradley strutted off, smirking, convinced he had handled another nobody, convinced that he had reasserted his authority. And in a way he had, just not in the way he intended. He had revealed his character. Unfiltered. Unchecked. And that was exactly what Denise needed. She was gathering more than just fallen documents. She was collecting proof, watching how no one stopped him, how the room barely reacted, how abuse, when dressed in uniform, too often goes unquestioned. And she wasn't just watching Walker. She was watching the whole system. "You don't teach arrogance a lesson by shouting back," she would later say. "You let it dig its own grave. Then you show up at the funeral, with receipts. And that's why she didn't rise. She didn't react. Because this was never about a courtroom seat. It was about something far bigger. By the time the precinct met later that day and Bradley Walker stood tall among his peers, mocking that woman in court, Denise Carter would walk through those doors again. But not in silence, not in heels, and a navy suit. This time she'd be wearing the uniform of a chief of police. And the look on his face would be worth every second of her stillness, because Denise wasn't there to fight. She was there to watch. And now that she'd seen everything she needed, it was time to act. The precinct's main briefing room had never been this packed. Officers squeezed shoulder to shoulder in tight rows, badges catching the overhead lights, radios crackling with half-muted chatter. The air was buzzing, not with urgency, but with speculation. Something big was happening. Everyone could feel it. Whispers moved like currents. You hear who the new chief is? I bet it's someone from city politics. Please don't let it be another paper pusher in uniform. Amid the noise and restless energy, Officer Bradley Walker was holding court in the corner of the room. Propped against a table like it was his throne, he was mid-story, voice booming over the low murmurs of the room. His tone was thick with arrogance, and the officers around him, some amused, some uneasy, listened as he bragged about his encounter in court that morning. Some random chick sitting in the back row like she owned the place, he scoffed, smirking. Told her to move. She gave me that attitude, you know the type, acting like she's somebody. So I showed her how things work in my courtroom. He chuckled, mimicking a kick with his boot. A few officers gave half-hearted laughs. Others shifted uncomfortably. But Bradley didn't notice or didn't care. He was too busy basking in his own sense of superiority. People like that, man, he went on. They think they're special just 'cause they wear a suit. Doesn't mean anything in this world. He paused, enjoying the sound of his own voice, confident that the room belonged to him, confident that his version of the story, the one where he was the enforcer and the woman was a nobody, was the one that mattered. But that fantasy was about to break. Suddenly, the door at the front of the room creaked open, and the mayor stepped inside. Instant silence. Officers snapped to attention. The atmosphere shifted instantly, from chaos to formality. No one expected the mayor to show up in person. When a mayor walks into a precinct briefing, it's not for small talk. Something serious was coming. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and glanced around the room. Then he smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady, formal, but with a subtle gleam of satisfaction in his tone. Thank you for your service, and for being here this afternoon. As you all know, today marks the introduction of your new chief of police. A murmur rippled through the room again, but quickly died down as the mayor raised a hand. This department is in a moment of transformation, he continued, and it requires a leader with integrity, experience, and vision. Someone who understands both discipline and dignity. Someone who leads not from ego, but with purpose. Bradley stood up straighter. His grin slowly faded into something more serious, a flicker of unease flashing behind his eyes. He didn't like the way the mayor was speaking. Too measured, too direct, too rehearsed. The mayor looked toward the door. Please welcome your new chief of police, Chief Denise Carter. For a second, the room didn't move. The name hung in the air like an aftershock. Then the door opened again, and Denise walked in. Not in a navy blue suit this time, but in full dress uniform, every button polished, every medal gleaming. Her badge shone like a silver flame against the dark blue of her jacket. Her shoulders squared, her eyes forward. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. She moved through the room like a general walking the battlefield after. The war had already been won. You could hear jaws dropping. A collective gasp swept across the room like a wave crashing against reality. No one dared speak. No one except Denise. She climbed the steps to the front of the room and stood next to the mayor, facing the crowd of stunned officers. Bradley Walker looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face drained of all color, his posture wilted. He blinked hard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The woman from the courthouse. The woman he'd kicked, disrespected, humiliated. She was now standing at the podium, wearing his future on her shoulders. He opened his mouth. No words came. Denise didn't even look at him. Not yet. She looked at the room. Her voice was calm, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. "I stand before you not just as your new chief," she began, "but as a guardian of accountability and a believer in justice that applies to every badge, every rank, and every name in this department." Her eyes swept over the room. No one moved. "I didn't take this job to win popularity," she continued. "I took it to restore honor. That means some changes are coming, some hard conversations, and, yes, some consequences." She paused, just long enough for the words to sink deep, then finally she turned. "Officer Bradley Walker," she said, "front and center." The tension exploded like a thunderclap. All eyes turned to Bradley. He didn't move at first. Couldn't. His feet felt cemented to the floor, but the silence pressured him forward like a storm pushing a leaf. He stumbled to the front, every step sounding louder than the last. His hands were shaking. His forehead glistened with sweat. Denise pulled a folder from under the podium. She opened it slowly, deliberately. "This is a formal notice of suspension," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty pending a full investigation into your conduct in today's courtroom, as well as your history of civilian complaints." You could feel the air thicken. Some officers looked at each other, exchanging glances. A few nodded slightly, others remained frozen. But no one came to Bradley's defense. He opened his mouth, desperate to find a way out. "Chief, he stammered. Denise cut him off. Her tone sharpened, final. "There is no room for hate, prejudice, or abuse of power under my leadership. Your time here is over." Silence. And in that silence was a rare kind of justice. The kind that didn't scream, didn't lash out, didn't need vengeance to be loud. It simply was. Denise turned back to the room. "This was never about ego," she said. "It was always about justice, delivered with elegance." And with that, she stepped down from the podium. Not to applause, but to respect. The kind of respect you don't demand. The kind you earn. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels electric. Like every molecule in the room knows something irreversible is happening. That was the air in the precinct briefing room the moment Denise Carter pulled the folder from under the podium. No one spoke. No one moved. Every officer stood suspended between disbelief and dawning recognition. The room was no longer just a space for announcements. It had become a courtroom, a reckoning ground. And standing at the front, Officer Bradley. Walker was about to receive his verdict. His swagger was gone. His confidence had evaporated the moment Denise Carter walked through that door in full uniform. Now, under the weight of her gaze and the weight of his own actions, he stood exposed. Not just to her, but to every fellow officer in the room. Men and women he once mocked, dominated, or dismissed, now watched him stumble forward, every step, a struggle. His once confident posture now bent and unsteady. Sweat beaded across his brow, not from heat but from fear. Real fear. The kind a man feels when he knows the system he hid behind can no longer protect him. Denise didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm carried a gravity that was louder than any shout. Her presence was discipline in motion. She didn't look angry, she looked resolved. Because for her, this moment wasn't personal. It was institutional. She opened the folder with deliberate care, the paper inside pristine and final. Holding it in both hands, she began to speak, not just to Bradley, but to every officer standing in that room. The law, she said, was never meant to be a weapon of fear. It was created to protect, to serve, to ensure dignity, not to destroy it. But when the people entrusted to uphold that law twist it for their own prejudice or pride, then the law must also hold them accountable. She turned, locking eyes with Bradley, who stood frozen like a man waiting for a sentence he already knew he deserved. Officer Walker, she announced, her voice steady but firm. Effective immediately, you are suspended from active duty, pending a full internal investigation into your conduct in court this morning, as well as your long-documented record of civilian complaints. She extended the paper toward him. For a moment he didn't take it. His hands were trembling too much. His lips parted as if to speak, perhaps to defend himself, or deny it all, but no words came. His throat caught. His eyes darted around, the room looking for an ally. A familiar nod. A rescue. None came. The same officers who once laughed at his jokes now looked away. Some stared at the floor. Others stood motionless, caught between discomfort and approval. And a few, just a few, nodded. Subtly, silently, because they had been waiting for this too. Maybe they had suffered under his reign. Maybe they'd been quiet witnesses. But now, the silence belonged to someone else. Bradley finally reached out and took the suspension notice, his hand shaking as the crisp paper passed into his grasp like a torch burning out. He was still trying to speak, still trying to muster an explanation, but Denise didn't give him the satisfaction of an audience. She stepped closer, her voice lowering, no longer for the room, but for him. There's no room for hate, prejudice, or abuse of power under my leadership, she said coldly. Your time here is over. Each word was final, immovable. She wasn't threatening, she wasn't vengeful, she was simply done. The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a chair moved, not a radio clicked. It was the kind of silence that follows truth when it arrives too heavy to ignore. The sound of a chapter closing, a regime ending. Bradley backed away slowly, his feet unsteady, his world spinning. It was only now, after all his bluster, after all his mocking words and smug confidence, that he realized he was the only one shrinking. The room hadn't turned on him. It had simply outgrown him. Denise turned to the crowd, her voice now inclusive, sweeping. This department has work to do, she said. We will rebuild trust. We will retrain. We will reform. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. The days of fear and unchecked authority end here. Today. A few heads nodded again. Stronger this time. Others let their breath out slowly, the way people do when they've been holding it for far too long. She continued. Leadership is not about titles. It's about truth. And the truth is, some of you have been waiting, hoping for accountability to finally show up in this building. Well, I'm not here to make promises, I'm here to deliver results. The energy shifted. The silence now felt different, no longer stunned, but hopeful. A quiet sense of something new being planted. The beginning of order after years of quiet chaos. Bradley was still standing at the edge of the room, holding the suspension letter like it might disappear, but it wouldn't. It was real. Tangible. His reckoning had arrived, not in a dramatic explosion, but in precision, timing, and truth. Because Denise Carter knew something that men like Bradley never understood. Justice doesn't need to scream, it too. Just needs to show up, prepared. And sometimes all it takes to dismantle a legacy of fear is a woman with a folder, a badge that shines like armor, and the will to stand tall in a room full of silence. That day marked the end of a chapter for Bradley Walker. But for the department and for everyone watching, it was the beginning of something else, something long overdue. What Denise Carter did that day was more than suspend a rogue officer. She didn't just hand out a disciplinary form. She sent a message that echoed through every hallway, every locker room, every closed-door conversation in that precinct. And it didn't end in that briefing room. That was just the beginning. Under Denise's leadership, the department underwent the kind of transformation most leaders are too afraid or too compromised to pursue. Mandatory ethics retraining was implemented. A full internal audit of officer conduct histories began within the first week. The buddy system that once protected toxic behavior was dismantled. Whistleblower protections were restructured to Make sure no officer would ever have to choose between their conscience and their career again. Every shift briefing started with one sentence on the whiteboard. Integrity is not optional. She didn't do it through fear. She did it through clarity, vision, unwavering moral discipline. Denise wasn't there to make enemies or friends. She was there to rebuild the foundation. She understood something that most never do. Suspending one bad officer may feel like justice, but changing the culture that allowed him to thrive, that's where real justice begins. Because corruption doesn't grow in the dark. It grows in silence, in the shrugs, in the "that's just how he is," in the ignored complaints and erased footage. Denise didn't just shine a light. She changed the entire wiring. But she also knew this was only the start. Systems don't change overnight. Cultures don't crumble from one speech. What she sparked was a movement, one fueled by accountability, yes, but also by example. Because when one woman stands firm, others find their footing too. And still, this was not a fairy tale ending. It was a first battle won in a long war. Denise knew there were others like Bradley out there, some louder, some sneakier, some who would smile in her face while sharpening knives behind her back. But she also knew one truth. Justice is not a moment. It's a marathon. So now, we turn to you. If you were Denise, would you have called him out in the courtroom, right then and there? Or would you have waited for that one perfect moment where the truth hits harder than any punch ever could? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how you would have handled it. If you believe in leaders who stand tall in silence and strike with purpose, show them some love. And if this story moved you, if it made you clench your jaw, hold your breath, and feel that sweet rush of justice, subscribe. Because what's coming next, it's bigger, darker, and even more dangerous. And Denise Carter, she's just getting started. Stay tuned.